Hi everybody and welcome to our webinar. We are on webinar 48. I just had to quickly check my notebook. Today we are talking about values-driven social work practice, and we have a special guest tonight, Caroline Aldridge. So we have 45 people and I'm just going to chat to you for a little while. Think of me as the person that holds the door open if we're in an actual conference centre. So I'll be holding the door open, I'll be saying take a seat, but that's not relevant because you're all in your own homes. Hopefully you've got a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. So I know I always ask you a question, and what I would like to know is, where in the world are you? Let's see how quickly we can go international. Are you a social worker? Are you a student? What area of practice are you? Are you just interested in this webinar? Tell us a bit about yourself in the chat and I'll try to catch as much of it as I can. Today is going to be quite a difficult webinar. Perhaps Caroline will be sharing some personal experiences, so please look after yourself. If you are affected by anything, if you do need to take a break, that is absolutely fine. The webinar will be on YouTube if you need to step away and catch up with it. And also please don't take any of your own screenshots of the presentation. The whole thing will be on YouTube afterwards, but Caroline's asked that we don't share anything outside of the webinar tonight, but it will be on YouTube so you can catch up.
It's fabulous to have everybody here. It's one of those webinars where I can just sit back and learn tonight, and I've got my pad ready to make some notes because I always learn a great deal. But what I would say is the book that you're about to hear about, so you know, the title is Applying the Lessons from He Died Waiting, is one of the most beautiful books that I have read in social work for just so many years. So those of you who are social work students, if you want to learn how to write reflectively, I would absolutely say to you, read this book, because you will learn how to write reflectively. There are so many lessons from the book. So I've got little don't know if I can hold it up to the screen, but I've got lots of little bits written on it in highlighter pen all the way through, and it's actually going to be my me reading this is my Social Work England entry for this quarter, because I do something quarterly for Social Work England. So it is such an important book. I learned such a lot from it that I asked Caroline if she would come along and talk to us. And so she's going to apply some of the lessons from the book, but talk to us about social work values. And this is something that is international. I can see we're getting more of our international guests in now from the Philippines. I saw some other international guests earlier. And this is something that is a global lesson really for all of us. So thank you so much, Caroline, for joining us tonight. I'm going to ask you now if you want to put your microphone on and lead us through the evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm Caroline Aldridge. I've been beautifully introduced, and I've been a social worker for a good few years, and a lecturer. But my son died in 2014, and it's a long story that I ended up writing this book. So I'm just going to talk you through a bit about who I am and what it's about. So as I'm a social worker, I'm an educator, I'm now an author. I never thought I'd say that. I'm also a researcher. I'm doing a doctorate in health and social care. I'm an activist. I've discovered I'm an activist. I didn't know I was an activist until I became one. I'm a bereaved mother, but I'm so much more. I'm a quilter, I'm a friend, I'm a grandmother, and I think we can all describe ourselves in so many ways. And a lot of what we're talking about tonight is about that, how our personal and professional selves twine together and the sense we make of that as professionals. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of a flavour. What I'm going to do over the next hour is give you sort of a flavour about the book, what it's about, why I wrote it, to think about social work values and how we use them, to explore how Tim's story, Tim's my son, my oldest son, can be used to support learning and change, and to really make some use of tonight is to give actions for you to take away. So lots of opportunity for you to think about your practice, your values, and the kinds of social workers and other professionals or people that you want to be. You've already had a bit of a trigger warning, but I also want to just reiterate that I won't be dealing with the most sensitive stuff that's in the book in an open forum like this, but I will still be touching on some things around bereavement and loss, And any of those things could be triggering. I am going to share some photographs, and I know from having shared a few before that that can sometimes be very emotional for people. And I'm also going to read some little bits from the book, and again, they're quite emotive. So if you need to look after yourself, do. I would suggest right now you perhaps have a little think about your plan for what you might need to do if something triggers you. And know that it's absolutely fine to just switch it off, catch up later. Okay, I've got quite a few photographs on here. I made a conscious decision when I wrote the book. There are no photographs in it. There's only a photograph of a quilt. There will be a few photographs of Tim in here. And I prefer you not to use any stills because I don't want them popping up on the internet. Stills have a habit of finding their way onto Twitter or Facebook, and I wouldn't want to upset any of Tim's friends or family. But I'm okay with what's going on YouTube because I feel that whoever looks at these things is someone who's looking for the purpose of education. Okay, so there were quite a few quilt photographs, you'll see. Little bits will come up. So before we start, I wanted to kind of capture a couple of things. So I've asked the team here to, if you put in the chat what you think social work values are, they're going to capture that over the next few minutes. And later on, I will ask what came up. And I've also got a poll. I wanted you to tell me, do you think our values can change? And you can do yes, no, or maybe. Okay, and I can see people are doing that. So, and I will come back to these things. Okay, right, now I have a slight technical hitch because the poll is right in the middle of all my prompts, but that's okay. So the book, I'd sort of explain what it's about really. I started writing it very much with my social work educator's hat on, thinking about all the learning that could come out of the events that happened to Tim and then to myself. But as the story developed, I ended up realising that it had a much wider appeal and decided that it needed to be more accessible and to everybody. So in a nutshell, it's a story of my eldest son, Tim, who had bipolar disorder. And he was in crisis, but so were mental health services. So part of the title is about the crisis in mental health services. So he could never access services, and he died waiting for an appointment that simply came too late. And he's not the only person to die waiting for an appointment. This is quite a frequent thing that happens. So at the beginning of the book, the first bit, I kind of get you to think about who Tim is and his place in our family as a very loved and loving member of our family, to try and get people to start connecting with who he really was, not a service user, but a person with value. And then I move on to what happened afterwards, which if I hadn't experienced it, I would never have believed. What happens after someone dies, after a service user dies. There's a process that kicks in that's really quite shocking and appalling. And this sort of empty rhetoric of learning the lessons, you'll have all heard this, you know, every time there's a death on the news or something, I'll say we're learning the lessons, we're committed to learning the lessons. And as an educator, I kind of think, what is it about the things they do that would actually help anyone to learn from these events? And I'm not convinced that much that happens in unpicking things that go wrong really transposes into learning for people on the front line. So that's something that really interests me. And then as the book goes on and I was writing it, I started researching around it and I started uncovering these wider systemic failings. And I was talking to Siobhan and we were talking about the emotionally barren work settings. And actually I was really thinking about, there's a lot of students here tonight, a lot of practitioners from different health and social care settings, and thinking about those settings that you work in that are emotionally barren, compassionless settings. And how do we maintain then as professionals our compassion and manage our emotions and the emotions of the people we work with and for and serve in these kind of environments. So can I get rid of the poll? Yes. Okay. Were you all seeing that poll all that time? Oh golly, sorry about that. This is me and technology. Right, okay. So I would say Tim was never the right kind of ill to get help. Services are kind of designed around services. They're designed around what commissioners and providers and organisations want to provide. But people who are unwell might not fit into any of those kinds of things, and Timothy certainly didn't. When he was very unwell, he was frightened and suspicious of services and difficult to engage. And when he was slightly better, that services would just say, there's not a lot wrong with you. And I talk about the way his vibrancy was reduced to a mere whisper. It was as if who he was as a person was entirely lost. When I got his files, there was nothing in the recordings about him that I recognised. As his mum, I was just like, all the important things are missing about who he was and what mattered to him and what mattered to us. So I'm just going to read you a very short little section from one of the little chapters called An Ordinary Life. My tale is biased in the way any mother's account would be. I can only write about my truth and the way I experience things. My truth is coloured by being Tim's parent and my heightened emotions of grief and love. My truth is influenced by incandescent anger at the standards of Tim's care and the savage austerity cuts that have decimated services. My truth is balanced by an allegiance to colleagues who demonstrate compassionate care in the most difficult of conditions. As a social worker and an educator, my truth is tempered by my professional passion for promoting good practice. Too often, when service users die, any sense of who they are and what value they are to their families is lost in the organisational responses. Precious loved ones become statistics. Like so many others, when Tim died, his early years and family connections were somehow erased in the records of his life. Without an appreciation of his unique value, any comprehension of the impact of his loss was missing. So getting to know Tim through his story is important, but there are holes in my story, gaps I chose to create, plus all the missing parts that I simply do not know about. I find myself moving backwards and forwards through decades with the ease of a time traveller as I recall events. This is no neat chronology. It's a series of vignettes that meander through the years. So my story is utterly, utterly biased. It's my story, and I'm not ashamed of that. And I think as students and professionals, we need to own our own stories and be proud of our own stories and our histories. And I find that too often the circumstances we work in mean that people are ashamed and hide that. And I think it's really important that we honour and support our colleagues and friends to be open. Okay, so Tim died in 2014. He was one of 139 unexpected deaths at just one trust in just 1 year. So that's the deaths that count in the statistics. That's the ones that they can't escape, the ones they can't escape owning by ring fencing all sorts of criteria that means it's not us. So there are lots and lots of Tims. And I've said that, you know, the way that bereaved relatives are treated by organisations is truly appalling. The systems go into a defensive position and there's no compassion. Often even the simplest things like getting somebody's name right on a condolence letter is missing. And Tim was referred to in some of the documents as the deceased. Some of the documents I had, he wasn't even dignified with a name. And that was pretty shocking, but it was just one of many, many things. So really, I wrote the book not as a sort of let's beat up everybody for what they got wrong, but more as a sort of plea, really, for people to be decent. So I say it's a plea for policymakers, organisations, professionals and the public to exercise decency, challenge unsafe or unkind practice, support people in distress and push for improved services. It became a sort of never-ending story. I started off half this size and it just kept growing because I kept finding out more and things kept happening. So I'm just going to read another little bit. So this is from a chapter called The Neverending Story. As I was writing this book, the situation kept evolving and shifting. Simultaneously, my understanding grew and developed. Like one of my quilts, the story is a patchwork of sub-stories. I feel this needs some explanation, but I've discovered it's not really the done thing in literary works to write about the process of writing. It's like exposing the raw edges and tangled threads that are hidden inside quilts. What people want to see is the glorious finished product. They don't want to know that it needed lots of unpicking and restitching. Recipients most certainly don't want to be told if they look closely they can see where the seams don't join. I've broken the unwritten rules and shared with you some of my workings out, because sometimes when we deconstruct things, we see beyond the superficial. I've teased out the tangled threads of injustice to understand how the strands connect. Hopefully this has helped you to understand the complexity and made you curious about what lies in the batting between the layers. The batting is the wadding, the padding between different layers of fabric in a quilt. When I started this book, I had a clear design in mind. Like my plans for a patchwork quilt, I had selected my fabrics, chosen the pattern of each block and worked out the size. I could envisage the finished product. Anyone who knows me well would immediately know that I rarely stick to a plan. I go on an explorative journey, and many an intended cushion has ended up as a bed cover. It was the same with this story. It has evolved as my understanding of what needed to be written has shifted. The loose materials that did not look like they belonged together at first, but there were threads connecting them. And as I started researching for corroborating evidence, I uncovered more and more poor practice and organisational corruption across health and social care. The emotional violence meted out to bereaved families and members of staff who raise concerns goes way beyond my wildest exaggerations in my imagination. It's terrifyingly real. I kept finding more pieces that must be incorporated. My writing has a purpose. I wanted to speak up for all those with whispered lives who are being utterly failed by the system. That drive gained momentum as my awareness grew of how many people have been shamed or bullied into silence, while the orchestrators of unsafe practice thrive. A powerful and deadly vacuum pulls individual stories into a pit of lessons that are never learned. My desire to throw light onto something that is a national issue kept me writing. Looking over what I've written, I can see that in the different sections of this book, sometimes my professional or personal voice predominates. Mostly my dual identities merge. Who I am as a social worker and educator is entwined with who I am in my relationships, my heart, my imagination. We are all complex beings. Our personal and professional experiences shape our values. Tim has shaped my values and changed me. His life and death have taught me so much. Because of him, I've been on a journey of discovery. Okay. So when we're starting to think about our values, we really need to think about ourselves, who we are, reflexivity, what makes us tick. What are the things that have coloured and shaped us? So we need that awareness of our feelings and our reactions and our assumptions. And this is a dynamic thing. Reflexivity is not a static thing, it's dynamic. It's in every interaction we do. What do we bring? How are we influenced? And I've gone through, the book's 100,000 words, and I know the students will be writing lots of reflections and going, oh, 1,000 words. But really, we can all do it, and it's really healthy for us to unpick what's going on for us, and it makes us more compassionate and attuned practitioners. And we all have this entwined selves, the different parts of ourselves that as we are coming into social work or working with people in mental health settings, we can't separate those things. We need to be able to work out how those threads tangle together, what's going on in the layers underneath, the things that nobody sees. the things that we know, the things that we might not even be aware of ourselves. And ultimately, He Died Waiting is a love story. So I say this, the intensity of my love for Tim correlates to the pain of my grief. My love of and for my family has kept me strong. I feel a sense of love for my fellow humans. I empathise with them and react emotionally to their pain and loss. It is this love that underpins my passion for practice and social justice. In the end, what matters most is love. One of the things I'm not going to explore tonight that I explore in the book is around that kind of concept of professional love, really. You know, how can we be kind and loving and caring practitioners and still look after ourselves and still be able to behave in a way that treats the people that we serve as in genuine relationship with us, as true value. So then let's have it, because somebody was going to tell me then, what values did people identify in the chat? What came up?
So I think Dave was going to say, but I don't know, I'll put my mic on. Can you hear me okay, Caroline?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Dave and I can maybe do it together, but I noticed there were so many repeats. I don't know what you saw, Dave. I was trying to write them all down, and I saw compassion come up a lot.
Yeah.
And I saw empathy, and very often people put compassion and empathy together.
Yeah.
So that came through a lot. Reliability was there. Being non-judgmental was there. Dave, are there any that, I mean, I've got others, but are there any, did you want to share?
So absolutely. A few that I found interesting was honesty came up. The concept of being honest, integral, having integrity, and being respectful. One that I found moving, and I always find moving, is that people put hope. Now I know that's more of a feeling, but I think it should be tied into all of our values, and being hopeful on behalf of people we work with.
Absolutely. I love that one.
Is there any more, Siobhan, that you had? I've got a few, but
I had congruence, which I thought was an interesting one. So people put congruence, justice as well, and empowerment.
Okay, we've got some really interesting ones there. We've got what I would call all the classic ones. If I said to any group of social workers or students anytime, what are our values? And they will come up with that. And some of them, we really are clear what they look like. We understand, don't we, what we think honesty is like. But empowerment and non-judgmental, do we really understand what we mean by that? Are we really delivering on those things? One of the things I explore in the chapters in the book is all around judgments. We are all judgmental, and we're kidding ourselves when we think we're not. When I qualified as a social worker, and I went into the very first team in a child protection team, I remember saying to a friend, if I had time, I'd write a paper on anti-oppressive practice, academic myth versus practice reality, because I couldn't see anything in the job that I was being asked to do that looked like the values I was being told I should have. And so I think what you've come up with professional and some personal values there. So those values you came up with, a lot of them will appear in our professional values, you know, that come up under things like BASW code. Any of you here that are nurses, it's interesting in their professional values, things like kindness and compassion come up, but we don't have kindness in social work values in our professional global ones. And then we have our personal values, and I think they can get very muddied up, that we kind of think if we personally value something and it says on our professional list we do, that we kind of do, but how often do we really pull that back and unpick it and think about, okay, honesty, great one, but actually you talk to people about their attitude to, say, lying, their personal attitude to people who tell lies, and watch the judgments come flying in. They might also say they're non-judgmental, but actually when it comes to someone telling a few porkies and the judgments come flying in. But we work, don't we, to our personal values and our professional values that we're signed up to, and they can be in conflict with our other values, and the organisational values can really trip us up there. So organisations might value things like efficiency, value for money. They probably will have reliability on their list, but they're not likely to have empathy or compassion or even empowerment. And then I was just thinking, you know, I don't actually like the term service user. I talk in the book about, actually, we're talking about people with, it's just clunkier, isn't it, to say people with, people who need services. But I've used it and just thought, are the values, are the things that our service users value, how do they fit with those other sets of values? And who overrules who? When those things are in conflict, who trumps who? When our personal values are in conflict with our professional or organisational, when are we going to capitulate and do what we're supposed to do or told to do or paid to do? And when are we going to stand up and say, no, that's against my values? And actually lots of you at the beginning of your career, and I would say, I want you to be really highly value driven. But if you're too value driven right now, you're not going to have a career. You're going to be out the door before you've even started. So it's, how do you balance those things? How do you hold true to those core values and do your jobs, but be true to yourself and true to the people you want to serve and true to the job you want to do, the reasons you came into the profession? And there aren't any easy answers to these things, but it's quite helpful sometimes to just unpick it and think, we talk about values all the time. Oh yeah, it's values, but what do we mean? What do we actually mean by that? And whose values are we talking about? So I was thinking then, in the book, I talk a lot about how values underpin and inform practice. All the way through, I talk about values-based leadership and, you know, the values were a kilter here or there. And it's really only since I've finished writing the book and life's taken a few more shifts for me that I've started to think, there's actually, is that really reflecting where I'm at with my values? And so I've got two quilts here. One of these quilts come up a lot in my talk and writing and everything, but the one on the left with all the squares, that's one I made for Tim's father after Tim died, and it's all pieces from Tim's life, throughout his life. So it's a very emotive and important quilt. It's not very good, and artistically it doesn't have much merit, but it has an awful lot of emotional value. But it is, in a sense, a straightforward quilt. It's just a grid of different blocks. And if we think about our values as being value-based practitioners, we've probably got a grid of honesty, non-judgmental, integrity, a grid of blocks that we kind of think, these are our values. But when I think about values-driven practice, and I've only recently really started to get my head around that, I think there's more purpose to it. It's more about our values not just underpinning what we do, but about giving us the momentum, the purpose, the drive, the vision to be the practitioners that we want to be. So the quilt on the right with the hearts, that was made for Tim's cousin. And you can see it's got all the elements of a quilt, but there's actually like a centre to it. There's a purpose. The hearts give some depth to the meaning. There's a lot more obvious messages about this being about love. The one on the left is about love. The one on the right probably says that more clearly to somebody that's just looking at it. So there's a subtle difference there about whether we are values based or whether we're actually going to let those values inform our decisions, inform our direction, inform how we move forward. Right, now I've lost, here we go. So when I think about applying the lessons, this quilt here, this is a piece from a quilt that I made. I talk about it in the book. After Tim died, as a family, we raised some money to send some young people to Canada to go and speak at a mental health conference. And this is one of the things we did, is I made a quilt and we raffled it. So this quilt has a real purpose, and it has a purpose of raising awareness about mental health. So 1 in 4 of the blocks has got some black in it to represent that 1 in 4 of us could at any time experience some mental health difficulties. And there are various amounts of black. So some have only got a tiny amount, kind of representing that might only be a small part of our lives. Others are much more intense. There's one square there which has got bright colours and it's got repairs in it, and that's one of the 100 squares to represent that 1 in 100 of us might experience a psychosis at some time in our lives. And all of the materials are all from everyday materials. They're from shirts and clothing, and they go right through the lifespan. There's bits there from baby clothes, from clothes that belong to working clothes, best clothes, new clothes, clothes from an older person, to kind of show that actually mental health affects all of us. And that kind of pinwheel quilt shape is my way of representing that we're all in relationship, that we're humans and we're interconnected, that we don't exist in those square blocks as we saw in the last quilt. We're actually much more dynamic. So I would say when you're thinking about your practice and your values, ask yourself what underpins your purpose. And when I look at the services that Tim received, they were purposeless. I say this, his contact with services was episodic. Nobody did anything for years other than to do snapshot assessments and refer him on. And I wonder how many of you have come across that already in your practice settings, where actually the purpose seems to be a throughput of assessing and discharging, or assessing and doing a short intervention and moving on out, sort of snapshot views of people's lives, seeing them in that moment, in perhaps their worst times, so that you lose appreciation of what they're like when life's going well for them, what they're like in their other aspects of life. So I think it's really helpful in everything we do to think, what is my purpose? What am I trying to do here? And then the next question I've got is, what in your practice enables you to see the beauty? We talk a lot, don't we, about having strengths-based practice, and lots of people have that, put that down as a value often, strengths-based, I'm empowering. Okay, so what does that mean? And how do we actually see the beauty? How do we see the beauty and the good in people that are in perhaps the worst of times, when we're perhaps seeing the worst of their behaviours, when we're seeing them when they're getting things wrong? What is it about our values, your own personal values or your professional values, that helps you to see people more holistically, to see them as valued human beings? And I've talked about Tim's files, and what I said was this: the files record his life in a way that misses the point of him. There is no recognition of his intelligence, his caring nature, his resilience, or his value to friends and family. And if you pause for a moment and think about the files that you've read and seen, I can almost guarantee that you will have seen files that, if you are honest, they've missed the beauty of the person. They've missed the point of the person. That there is a series of people's deficits and very little appreciation of who they really are and what really matters to them. So I talked about layers. Quilts have layers. There's the top layer, the showy layer, with either pieced materials or fancy stitching. And then there's a base layer that if you turn it over, sometimes that can be as beautiful as the front and sometimes it's not. And then in between you have this batting, you have the wadding, and in there gets snarled up and caught all the raw edges and the tangled threads and the knots. And in my case, because I'm a messy worker, all the bits that have sort of somehow got stuck off the sewing room floor and got wedged in between there. And if we think about that in terms of our values, we've got our showy values, the top layer that we see, don't we? They're all the things that empowerment, non-judgmental, integrity, all these concepts that can be actually quite meaningless if they're just there as a top layer. And if we're talking about value-based practice, you need that supported by the other two layers. It needs to support it, to give the quilt function and purpose, and to make it a usable thing. So it's really important. And when we ask people to be reflective and be reflexive and start looking at themselves and what they bring in there, you're actually being asked to dig into that layer in between that maybe you've never looked at, to start thinking about not just what goes on in the surface that everybody else sees, not what just goes on the back that you can look at if you turn it over, but what might be in the middle, what might actually be doing a really strong purpose of joining these bits together, because actually the threads then go through those layers and that's how it all joins together. Okay. And so when you're thinking about understanding the layers, for me, the critical layer, the critical value is actually around things like love and kindness. So I say love, like compassion, are human necessities that keep us in the realms of kindness. And when I think about the quilts I make them, I give most of them away. They're very much a thing of comfort. Tim used to wear his quilt like a cloak. His friends told me that when the power went out, and the power frequently went out because he hadn't got any money or he'd spent it on things that weren't the wisest choices, he would wear his quilt that I made him and he would wear it like a lord. And I just like to think, I've written about that, actually it brought him comfort, that it was a tangible thing where he could see and be reminded of the love we had for him. So I'm a bit of a fan of quilts. So I asked the question, can our values change? And because I didn't work out how to get rid of the poll off the screen, I saw the answer, which was most of you thought yes. And I'm really, really pleased to see that, because sometimes people say, no, they're fixed. You know, you can't teach empathy, for example. You either are empathic or you're not. And I would argue we can all change. And this is a picture of me and Tim. I'm an unrecognisable me. Here I am, grey hair, almost 60, had a few knocks in life. And I can tell you that the values I held there, I was about 24 there, and we're counting fish, are not the same as the values and the things I hold dear now. Some are. Some things run through me like a stick of rock. Other things have changed as I've learnt and reflected and experienced things. And in the book, there's a little chapter where I talk about counting fish, because there was a moment towards the end of Tim's life where I was finding it all a bit overwhelming, feeling very sad really about what I could see was happening to him. And I'd gone off into the garden and I was looking at the fish in our fish pond, and he came up behind me and he put his arms around me and he said, "Mum, what are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm just counting fish, Tim, just counting fish." And he said, "You know, Mum, sometimes it's really important just to stop and count fish." And I hold that one because he was right. I learned a lot from Tim. I learned a lot of my values from him, that actually we rush around and we don't always pause and stop. And sometimes it's important to stop and count fish, or do whatever it is you need to do to bring your minds back into a calm, alert state. So I'm just checking where I am time-wise. Oh, I'm doing great. Okay, so one of the things I wrote the book for was, I'm not expecting to get rich or famous. I really wanted it to make a difference. And I wanted it to be used to support people to be able to practice with good values. So for me, if you have the values are right, then everything else can be learnt and will come, it will follow. So anybody who knows me, any of my students will know I just go on and on and on about values. For me, it's just critical to everything we do. It's the most important thing. So some of the resources, I've done some free resources that are on my website that anyone can use, because I wanted the book to be used as a learning tool. So these are the two resources that are on there. There's a chapter from the book, which is more or less the first chapter, Ignorance is Bliss. And I start the book by looking at my own starting point, my own values, looking at me, the child in the 1960s, and the things within my family and my life that shaped my attitude towards mental health. So if you like, those starting points, when we saw that picture of the young me with the young Tim, you know, this is what the young woman thought about things. The young me thought about things with what I knew then. And so my friend and colleague Claire Skilleter turned that into an activity for me, which is around reading the chapter, and then there's some really nice values-based questions that get you to think about your own families, your own family scripts, the things that drive you, the things that make you who you are. So really great exercise for any practice educators, but actually any students. I would say, you know, you don't have to buy the book. You can download it from the free from the internet, read a chapter, and there's an activity you can do to really stop and perhaps fit in, having watched this, with thinking, okay, let me have a look at myself now. So that's there. And then it's also got 5, I made, had a load of postcards done with quotes from the books, and 5 of them are there for free with some values-based questions to support reflexive discussion. So again, you can just download it for free, and for each of the postcards, and I've read you some of the quotes out tonight, and then it's got kind of questions that get you to think about, in your work setting, what does this look like? How would you know it? And again, my colleague Claire wrote most of those ones for the 5. I've then gone on and created a little booklet to go with 16 of the cards. They are, you know, they can be bought, but they're great for practice educators, with a little booklet and the other postcards. I was trying to think about how people could use the book easily. Busy practitioners, busy students, busy practice educators. You want to do something with this stuff, but you haven't really got time to prepare anything, something you can just grab and go. And so the postcards are absolutely great for maybe a team meeting where you could just look at one postcard, one question, and they're all on different themes. So they're there for free, and I'll be delighted for people to use it, and always delighted to hear how people use stuff and to have their ideas. Because for me, the real buzz is to know that this is being used and it's making a difference out there somewhere. Okay, I'm now going to move on to think about all of our mental health, because we all have mental health, and read you a little bit more from the book. The membrane between practitioners and the people who use services is semi-permeable. We are all service users at times. Even the most robust of us are likely to see a GP, and GPs can also get sick. Being a professional does not inoculate against difficult or traumatic life events. Tim and I encountered professionals from health, social care, education, the police, the coronial service, and voluntary agencies. There is a plethora of research to show that the emotional labour involved in these professions can negatively impact on the mental health of those who work in human services. Burnout is an issue across the helping professions. What is burnout? It's a socially acceptable term for mental health. Any of us could find ourselves in need of mental health services, any of us. We all have shadows lurking, things that by chance or circumstance can bring difficult times into our lives and threaten the ground under our feet. None of us knows what is coming next or what we might have to deal with. Illness, tragedy, life stressors, fractured relationships or financial hardships can strike without warning. It is part of the human condition for some people to find themselves in the shadows at the edge of society. It is the experience of many older people, people with learning disabilities, the homeless, the poor, those with mental or physical illness. Until we are tested, we cannot know the extent of our resilience. We cannot know when we will be pushed to the edge. When the shadows overcame my life, the darkness threatened my well-being. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed other people standing in the shadows. We connected. So many people have shared their stories with me. People like myself, mothers, social workers, educators, who have children whose mental health causes them great concern. There are others who feel the weight of responsibility and anxiety that I have felt. They are forced out of sight and left to deal with their own problems. They are kept in the shadows by the oppressive silence that surrounds mental health. They are held there by mother-blaming societal constructs that whisper about their parenting failings. I have highlighted many shortcomings, including plenty of my own. It's time to come out of the shadows. It's important to understand the scale of the problem. We all need to show more respect and kindness to people. As a society, we need to be more alert to the cries of those with whispered lives. We should notice them and listen attentively to their views, for they are our families, our friends, our neighbours, our fellows. Their lives are significant because we all have worth. We all have equal worth. So we all have mental health. So this kind of idea that it's somebody over there and that here we are, we're okay, and it's the others, it's them out there. We all have mental health, and we all need to protect our own, and we all need to protect and nurture other people's. And I just think of the judgments that are made about it, and I still hear them throughout my career. I have heard those judgments, and it's only in the last few weeks there's been a whole issue around a model of working with people with borderline personality disorder that's criminalised them, and the judgments that professionals who've signed up to all those codes of conduct are happy to, or maybe unhappy to, practice in a way that is so oppressive and othering and shaming of people. There is nothing to be ashamed of if we struggle with our mental health. It's a normal human reaction to life. Okay, so there is no them and us. This picture here, this my daughter, when we did the fundraiser to send the young people to Canada, my daughter, who can't spell, actually, we're all a bit dyslexic in my family, produced this poster to explain to people, you know, exactly that point. I mean, she hadn't listened to a presentation, she just had it in her soul to say, do you know, this is any of us, and she's written the word there, top left, anyone, daughter, dad, granddad, dementia, bipolar, alcohol. And the picture in the middle is a picture of Tim, and I didn't know that existed until after he died. His girlfriend gave it to me, and it's a picture of him having a diving lesson on a foreign holiday, and he's making the little symbol for okay. And it reminded me that for all his difficulties and problems, most of the time he was okay. And what everybody saw, what I saw a lot of the time was, as a worried mother, was all the things that he was struggling with. But actually there was so much about his life that was rich and pleasurable, and he meant such a lot to his family and friends, and he was the one within his friendship group who's the one who looked after everybody else. And after he died, people came to me with all their stories about all the lovely things he'd done, and I found it a bit ironic, as his mum that worried about him constantly. I found it really ironic that they would say things like, we felt safe with him because he looked after us, and I was just like, God, he could hardly look after himself, but he did. And I think that's a lovely reminder that my daughter made there. So I rather love that. And you can't read all the bits, but she'd written some bits about what this is, why we were raising the money and why it was all so important. And so I totally get all the arguments that we work in these compassionless environments that don't protect the mental health of their workforce, and they should take responsibility and should protect their workforce. But the reality is most of us are working in highly pressured environments, and so we actually do have to find ways of taking responsibility for our own mental health and our own self-care. So my self-care is to go down to my sewing room and sew. I literally sewed my way through the grief, sitting there crying and sewing, and the rhythmic stitches and creating something soothed. And I know when I'm really, really stressed, I just will say, I just need a couple of hours to sew, because my mind gets engaged in what I'm making and creating, and my hands are busy, and it gives me a break from whatever worries I've got. A time to sort of allow everything to calm down. And you will all have different ways, and I urge you all to find those ways that work for you. And this picture is of the stress balls that were on my desk in the year after Tim died, while I was still working for the Mental Health Trust, who were treating me absolutely appallingly. And that's part of the story and not for tonight. You have to read the book to see that bit. And I squeezed my stress balls so hard they kept bursting. So my colleagues brought me plasters in, and my stress balls have had their wounds dressed out of love and concern. So I was coming towards the end now. I'm thinking about how are you going to apply the lessons from this book, whether you've read it or not. And I kind of ask you to really to hold Tim in mind. If something tonight has touched you emotionally and made you think, oh, do I do that? Or I don't want to do that. Or that was important. How are you going to hold that in mind? How are you going to remember this? And how are you going to hold not Tim, but all the other Tims, all the people you work with in mind, to see them as those whole valuable people? And I'm kind of asking you really to start thinking about being values driven, not passive values based, but active values driven, to make your decisions about what you're prepared to do in your career, where you're prepared to work, what you're going to challenge around your values. So to do all of that, I need you to commit to being reflexive, and that can be really hard. When we start looking at ourselves, it can be painful, it can be really uncomfortable. We can kind of unravel, a bit like if a quilt's been poorly stitched together. If we start pulling it apart to have a little look, it might all fall apart at the seams. The good news is they're all repairable. If your quilt falls apart at the seams a bit because you've had a good look at what's inside, then get stitching and work out how you're going to put it back together. And to my mind, a beautifully repaired bit of fabric has more beauty and value than a pristine new bit any day. I love repairs. I've got lots of vintage fabrics, and I love to look at the carefully darned and repaired bits and think about the care and love and time someone's put in because they valued this garment or this piece of fabric, and it was worth fixing. It was worth spending time on putting it back together and making it usable again. And I want you to think about how you're going to challenge injustice. And I say that in a very light way, because if you all go out of here and go straight to your directors and start saying, this isn't right, the way we do this, your careers are going to be very short. You have to think about how you're going to do that. How are you going to model that kind, compassionate, values-based, values-driven practice? How are you going to be the kind of person that influences and challenges from whatever position you're in? And I think overall, be kind. So I said about what might you do as a reminder. This is mine. I've made some little, I'll show you a minute, little pledge kits. I've got a little pledge for Tim that I made, and it sits on my desk, and it reminds me when I'm doing things that this is what it's about. That while I'm doing all this stuff with it, when I'm feeling nervous about doing this tonight, it was, I looked at that and I picked it up, and it's very tactile. I gave it a little rub and I was like, yeah, I'm doing this for a good reason. I can do this. I've got this. And this this photograph is, there was a campaign in the city about 2 years after Tim died, and I was not in any place of my grief to be able to go. I can talk to you now, but I can tell you it was 4 years before I could even publicly say, you know, my son died. It was just too painful. But my daughter went, and with my grandson in a pushchair, and at the last minute she made a placard out of a cardboard box, and she went with some friends. And later on, I was looking on Twitter, and suddenly this appeared. Someone had taken this photograph in the gardens right near where Tim lived, and I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed because I recognised their handwriting, and it was just like, oh my, that has absolutely taken my breath away. So my pledge is to speak out, and I say that not a whisper but a shout, to break the shame and the silence that isolates, and to raise the something, because I can't see it because there's something in front of it, on Whispered Lives. So I've got pictures in front of it, so sorry about that. And I kind of say this in one of the postcards, probably a bit more eloquently than that bit just was. Some people are deemed to be of so little worth that their lives and their deaths are mere whispers, but his whispered life echoes loudly in the hearts of those who loved him. So, let me just, right, my cursor has disappeared, here it comes. So these are my pledge for Tim's. So I'm kind of asking you all tonight to think about what part you're going to play in nurturing and protecting the mental health of the people around you. Whether that's your family, your friends, your colleagues, your students, your boss. What tiny thing could you do? And I want you just to pause and think about what that might be. I don't want to see grand things because we very rarely follow through on those. I'd much rather see something like, tomorrow I'm going to go and I'm going to ask someone how they really are, or I'm going to bake someone a cake, or whatever it is you might do, or check up on my family member more often. And maybe you can put some of those things in the chat, and then afterwards you'll be able to, the team will be able to send me them, because I love to see the pledge for Tim. So if you want to put my pledge for Tim is, that would be lovely. And those of them I get, I'll post them on Twitter and Instagram, and I've got a Padlet wall where I'm gathering all the pledges together, which is a truly fabulous thing, where all these lovely pledges where people have read the book and they've gone, do you know what, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to do this little thing, because that's what I don't want. I don't want people reading it and going, oh, that was a sad story. What's on telly? I want people to think, I've read this book. What can I take away? How can I be different? What can I do? So to pledge something, because eloquent words are not inspirational or believable unless they're accompanied by actions. And this quilt is from my quilt, which has all my favourite bits. And you can see there's things from Tim's babyhood, his school uniform. There's another bit on there where there's the worn patch from the knee of his jeans. And it's a real reminder about how complex we all are, all the different aspects of our lives. And again, about what we value. Who would value the hole in the knee of a pair of jeans? But if it has meaning, because the person has meaning, then it has value. So those things are hugely important to me, but they're important reminders. And I've done something wrong here. Okay, if I could change one thing, it would be to increase kindness. If only we were kinder to each other and tried to understand that people want to do the right thing. And I think that's my real takeaway message is kindness. If we operate with kindness, if our values are kind, compassionate, empathic, and we really love our fellow human being, then we make better decisions. We think more clearly. We operate from a completely different base. So kindness, how can we be more kind? And then this will come out afterwards. These are all my contact details of Twitter and Instagram and my website and email. And I just love hearing from people and engaging in chat. So since I've written the book, I just get hundreds of messages from people saying all sorts of things, and I love it. So if I can be part of your conversations about how you're going to use this, where you're going with your careers, where you're going with your work, it's great. I just love it if somebody sends me something and says, oh, you know, I did this, I read your book, and then I went into work and I checked up on all the people that I hadn't heard from that I thought were probably okay because I hadn't heard from them, and I read your book and realised probably they're the ones that are I should be most worried about. And I think, result, something happened. Lovely. So do keep in touch. And oh yeah, if anybody wants to buy the book, there is a discount. You don't have to be a student, you just need to use the student code on the website. And I'm on Kindle, and I've missed a slide somewhere. Ah, yes, sorry, I don't know what I'm doing for time. So yeah, this is how I'd like you to use the book, to sort of tell people about it. But one of the things I was hoping that all of you might help me with is to talk to libraries. I'm having great difficulties getting the ebook into HEI libraries because all the big providers like EBSCO and ProQuest, there's a whole load of processes. So if you'd like to go and demand it from your libraries, that would help enormously. And your public libraries, because it's in a format that if you're on overdrive, so if any of you subscribe to your public library and recommend it as a book, they might purchase it, and then it becomes up on the list of available and gets seen. So that would be a great thing. I would love you to do that for me. And I also operate a pay it forward or nominate someone. So the book's created a lot of generosity. So I have people who will purchase books that I keep for when somebody's nominated that needs one. So if you want to buy one for someone else, you simply buy it, put the message on the website to say what you would like as a pay it forward for someone. And if you work with someone or know someone, or you are someone who can't afford to buy the book but would really like it, you can then contact me by email and say, I would like a book for myself or for somebody else because, and then when I've got some in the pay it forward pile, I match people up. So that's been really lovely. I've really enjoyed that, feeling that people are looking after each other and being kind to each other. And my thank yous then. Thank you to everybody for having me. Thank you for the team and Siobhan. I just want to thank all the social workers and students and educators who are working their socks off to deliver services and to be compassionate practitioners despite all of the pressures and difficulties and the environments they might work in. And also to everybody who's really encouraged me, read the book and sent me so many lovely messages, and the people who encouraged me to get to this point. So thank you everybody. And that's me. Right, I don't know how to
Caroline, thank you so much for sharing with us. The book is a beautiful book. It is, when you said earlier you don't want someone to read it and think, oh, that was sad, what's on the telly. I just honestly don't think anybody could ever do that. It is beautifully written. People have been talking about their use of the book in the chat, and we'll send it to you because I know you'll like
that. Yeah.
Abigail said she read the book in 2 days, but had a little cry at times during it. And I couldn't read it in 2 days. I had to read it in small parts. But what I loved about it was the way, almost like a patchwork quilt, when I think about it now, you did it in small bite-sized pieces for all of us, because it made me reflect so much that I just had to take a piece and really reflect on it. And it was just a beautiful book. There's so much learning in there. So I would encourage everybody to not just read it, but as Caroline said, get your universities to get it into libraries. One of the problems is I also struggle with getting books into libraries, and it's because it's the large corporate publishers that run what books we get shared with us. And that's really important for us to challenge that. If nothing else, challenge the books that are coming from the big corporate publishers who are just about making money. They're not about making a difference. And really what your book is going to do, it is really going to make a difference. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm really looking forward to it going on YouTube and getting loads of watch backs as well tonight, because you've shared just some really useful learning with us. There were also some really interesting questions in the chat about things like maybe do we not have a shared definition of what values are, and maybe values and principles and ethics, some of the things that came in earlier. And maybe we'll have a follow-up webinar on that, because I think that's a fascinating topic in itself. But thank you so much, Caroline. And you probably don't realise, but you have actually already inspired the topic that we're having next week. So last week we had Ian join us, who I know is here tonight because I've seen him in the chat, Samurai Social Worker, and people loved last week's webinar and this week's webinar, both of which have looked at mental health issues from different perspectives. Next week we're going to be looking at professional kindness, and I'm going to try, Caroline, to use some of what you've written as well as some of other things. I know, as you said earlier, nurses have kindness written into their standard expectations now, and we still don't. And I want to try and I think sometimes students always look to me for things about theory and reflection. So I'm going to try, if I can, next week to do some theorizing on professional kindness, so that we can actually talk about what theory have you used there? Well, actually, I've used some professional kindness, and there's an answer that is still theoretical. So I'm really going to try and tease that out next week. Super. So that's a bit of a challenge, but inspired by your work and your kindness as well, Caroline. So I think Dave's put in the chat the link for next week as well. And then we've also got the link for the following session, which is our big, huge graduation celebration. And I think people think you've got to be graduating to attend that. You absolutely haven't. So those of you who are here today who are in your first year or your second year of studies, come, because you are going to learn from that about the journeys that social work students have taken during COVID and so much more. And Caroline, we have bought a number of books from you as prizes on the night for people, and some of those will be given as prizes to the prize winners who have already been selected, but some of those will also be prizes for people attending on the night, because it is just such a beautiful book. So thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. We ordinarily, when we've had a guest at our webinar, we make sure that Dave gets the link in for next week and all of that into the chat, so people know they can register for next week. But then I normally say, would you like the final words to our special guest? So if I can give the final word to you, Caroline. I know that you will very much enjoy reading the pledges for Tim that have already been put into the chat when we send you the chat, I know that. But if I could ask you to maybe have the final word tonight.
I guess, what would my final word be? Be kind to yourselves, be kind to the people you serve, be kind to the people you work with. And I want to hear about you when you're the leaders, because all of you students will be the leaders one day. Some of you will go all the way, and you are our professionals of tomorrow, and take kindness with you all the way up. Wherever you go, take kindness with you.
Thank you. That's a beautiful message. Take kindness with you wherever you go and all the way up. That's really fabulous. Thank you so much. And good night to everybody. Thank you.